Hi there, I hope you are doing fine. This is Mr. Philip Kauma, the excellent biology tutor. We're looking at respiration, and this is part 1. Without wasting much of your time, let us begin. So, what are the objectives for this tutorial video? What are we going to learn at the end of this video? We're going to look at the definition of respiration. We're going to look at the types of respiration. We're going to look at ATP, okay? And finally, we're going to look at the importance of respiration. So this is part 1. Let us start by looking at the definition of respiration. Alright, so respiration is defined as the release of energy from food substances in living cells. I repeat, respiration is defined as the release of energy from food substances in living cells. This definition strictly applies to tissue respiration, which is also called cellular respiration or internal respiration. However, the term respiration is sometimes loosely applied to other processes that help make oxygen available to living cells. These are breathing, which is also known as ventilation, and gaseous exchange. In this case, the term external respiration is used. Let's pause there for a minute, okay? You and I, we are living organisms and we eat. Why timadia? Because ngatidadia we need energy from the food that we are eating. So if you stay hungry for a week, trust me, you won't have the energy that you have right now. You won't even be able to stand up. You won't even be able to do certain activities because your body does not have energy. So the reason why we consume food is so that we can have energy. And that energy is provided to living organisms by the process of respiration. Now, looking at the definition that we have been given, they're saying that respiration is defined as the release of energy from food substances in living cells. They've also told us to say this definition, though, strictly applies to internal respiration. Internal, what does that mean? Vevichitika mukati. Okay? Internal respiration, which is also known as cellular respiration or tissue respiration. So, here is my definition for respiration. Use this definition. This is a general definition. Respiration is the process that makes energy available for living organisms. Say it after me. Respiration is the process that makes energy available for living organisms. That's the definition. At the end of this process known as respiration, energy should be available. Energy should be the product. Okay? So respiration is a process that makes energy available for living organisms. Plants, animals like you and I, we all need energy. And this process of respiration provides us with that energy. Now, we've defined respiration. There are two types of respiration. We've got internal respiration and external respiration. They've already given us a definition for internal respiration here. They are saying that it is the release of energy from food substances inside living cells. This definition, it is for internal respiration. Now, what is the definition for external respiration? Okay, so external respiration, they've said here. However, the term respiration is loosely applied to other processes that help make oxygen available to living cells. So we can simply say external respiration, it is a process that makes oxygen available to living cells, because oxygen is a requirement in the manufacturing of energy in this process of respiration. So external respiration, my students, it is a process, or it's a type of respiration that makes oxygen available to living organisms. Are you following? Yeah. So that oxygen, which is made available, it is now used to make energy. So yeah, these are the definitions that I want you to stick with. Let us move on. Types of respiration. So we've already talked a bit about internal respiration. So internal respiration occurs where inside living cells, inside imachitikira muti mukati mwa cells. Internal respiration imachitikira mukati mwa cells, inside living cells, specifically in organelles called mitochondria. Mitochondria. Don't be confused mwamvera. Nanga organelles ndiye vichani? Organelles ndiye chani? Don't be confused, my student. Organelles, these are things like the cell wall, the nucleus, the cytoplasm, ribosomes, the vacuole, chloroplast. Those are organelles. But they are telling us to say, oh, internal respiration imachitika mu living cells inside an organelle called a mitochondria. That is for plural if you're talking about more than one. So if it's more than one, you say what? Mitochondria. But if it's only one, singular, mitochondrion. Mitochondrion. Okay? Yeah, and it's true. If I ask you, what is the function of the mitochondrion? You're going to tell me to say that's where respiration takes place. That is why the mitochondrion is also called the powerhouse. This is biology. Alright, so the main substrate for internal respiration in most organisms is glucose. So they've told us to say internal respiration imachitikira mu cells, specifically mu mitochondrion. And the main substrate, let us use another term, the main ingredient. Iyi ndiye ngati siriko iyi singachitike respiration, no matter what. If there is no this, we don't have this ingredient, respiration won't take place. So the main substrate for internal respiration in most organisms is glucose. Glucose is the main ingredient. Without glucose, respiration siriko, it won't take place in bozayo. Glucose should be available for the process of respiration to take place. So it is the main ingredient or main substrate. Okay, so yeah, don't be flummoxed or confused by this term substrate. Nanga substrate ndiye chani? We did enzymes. Mwikumbukira substrate? Mwikumbukira? A substance on which an enzyme will act on. So there will be an enzyme that will act on a substrate. So in this case, the main substrate is what? Glucose. Meaning there will be an enzyme that will act on glucose to form another product. Biology. Let us continue. So we are looking at internal respiration. So about internal respiration, we know two things. Number one, it occurs in living cells in a structure known as the mitochondrion, and the main substrate is glucose. Okay. Now there are two types of internal respiration, namely aerobic and anaerobic respiration. These are the two types of internal respiration: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Let's look at aerobic respiration, my excellent biology students. I'm enjoying this class. I'm enjoying this lesson. So aerobic respiration, this is a type of internal respiration. We understand that it occurs in cells, right? Yeah. So what is aerobic respiration? Aerobic respiration, this is the release of energy from food in living cells in the presence of what? Oxygen. Have you seen? Remember I said oxygen is important. Okay, it is important. It is a requirement. It is very important to produce energy. So aerobic respiration is a type of internal respiration that occurs in the presence of oxygen. Let me give you the definition again. This is the release of energy from food in living cells in the presence of oxygen. Pause. Consume that information. Alright, let us continue. This process releases a relatively high amount of energy, about 2,880 kilojoules. Kilojoules, these are units for energy, from 1 mole of glucose. Iyo ni chemistry manje, ma molecules. Alright? And the byproducts the byproducts produced are carbon dioxide and water. So aerobic respiration iyi imachitikira mumacells, okay? Vamene visankhala produced ikachitika ya aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen ni carbon dioxide, water na energy. So the main thing that is needed in this process is energy, but the byproducts vintu vamene visankhala produced in the process of making energy ni carbon dioxide na water. My student, whenever you hear the term byproducts, just know that these are things that are produced but they are not needed. Like chikwangwa cha nsima chija, it is a byproduct of the main meal, which is the nshima. So chikwangwa chija, it's produced along the way. Are you following? So it is the same even in this case. Carbon dioxide and water are produced along the way. Say it with me, along the way. Byproducts are produced along the way or in the process of producing the main thing. Alright, so 2,880 kilojoules are produced, okay, from 1 mole of glucose. Alright, let's bear that in mind. Let's keep it in mind. I number isungeni mumutu. This type of respiration occurs in tissue cells of animals and plants when there is a sufficient supply of oxygen. So aerobic respiration imachitika ngati kuli oxygen. Ngati kulibe oxygen sichitika aerobic respiration. Alright, the word and chemical equations for aerobic respiration are given below. TNT atambe. Iyi ndiye word equation ya aerobic respiration. So glucose, mwaona glucose nitakamba it's the main ingredient. So without glucose there is no respiration even if there's oxygen. So glucose is very imperative, my students. So glucose and oxygen, they are going to produce carbon dioxide, water and energy. What is the main thing here? It is energy. What are the byproducts? Carbon dioxide and water. So this is this is the word equation. What of chemical? In the chemical equation, please, isungeni mumutu. By now, you should know the chemical formula for glucose. So keep it in mind. Keep it. Whenever you're writing the chemical formula for aerobic respiration, always after energy, mu brackets unkulemba 2,880 kilojoules. Mayonaka. That's how it's supposed to be. And the equation should be balanced. It should be what? Balanced. Amaponzisa mu chemistry bazaka kuponzisa no science tuta balancing of chemical equations. So kaswateni na papa mwe kaswateni akakeve akakakale mu mind aka every day mfunika mwipitamu. You should make sure that you know this one. Alright, so that's what we have to know about aerobic respiration. It occurs in the presence of what? Oxygen. One type of internal respiration. Let's look at another type of internal respiration. Alright, so now we're looking at another type of internal respiration. We've looked at aerobic respiration and we've also looked at the chemical and word equation for an aerobic respiration. Yeah. Now let's look at an aerobic respiration. An aerobic respiration, yeah, bwanji. That's what we're trying to find out. So, an aerobic respiration. This is the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence, my students, in the absence of what? Oxygen. So imachitika kulibe oxygen. It occurs in the absence of oxygen. So there's a difference. Aerobic respiration, presence of oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, absence of oxygen. It occurs in the absence. Keep that in mind. Keep it. Sungeni. Alright. Now, under anaerobic respiration, there are types. Pali aerobic respiration penzeli ma types. Please, penzeli bebevi. But under anaerobic respiration, there are types. So, types of anaerobic respiration include alcoholic fermentation and lactic fermentation. Aya ndiye ma types of anaerobic respiration. We've got alcoholic fermentation and lactic fermentation. Say it with me. Come on, say it with me. Alcoholic fermentation and lactic fermentation. These are the two types of anaerobic respiration. Both of these types, they occur in the absence of oxygen. Apa petili manje, oxygen sifunika, it is not available. It occurs in the absence of oxygen. Alright, let's look at the first type, which is alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation ni vichiani. Okay, so alcoholic fermentation, this is the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence of oxygen, producing alcohol, which is ethanol, and carbon dioxide as byproducts. Are you following? So what are the byproducts of alcoholic fermentation? We've got alcohol, which is ethanol, and carbon dioxide. What were the byproducts of aerobic respiration? We said carbon dioxide and water. Apa petili apa manje, it is alcohol and carbon dioxide. Alcohol bwanji amene ichita produce apa ethanol. Ethanol is the alcohol. So let us define alcoholic fermentation again. This is the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence of oxygen, producing alcohol, which is ethanol, and carbon dioxide as byproducts. Wonderful, wonderful. So we know the byproducts. We understand that it occurs in the absence of oxygen. Cool, let us move on. This process releases a relatively low amount of energy, about 210 kilojoules from 1 mole of glucose. Mwaiona pali difference, pali aerobic respiration na alcoholic fermentation, which is a type of anaerobic respiration. Pali aerobic respiration, what was the energy that was produced? 2880 kilojoules from 1 mole of glucose. But under alcoholic fermentation, we are being told that 210 kilojoules of energy is produced from 1 mole of glucose. What does that mean? If respiration is happening in the absence of oxygen, low amounts of energy are produced. That is why I said oxygen is very important, my students. It's very much important. As you can see, in the absence of oxygen, low amounts of energy are produced. But in the case of aerobic respiration, which was happening in the presence of oxygen, high amounts of glucose were produced. Alright. So the reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme called zymase, which is naturally found in yeast. Alcoholic fermentation imachitika in the presence of an enzyme. So it is a catalyzed reaction. It is happening in the presence of an enzyme. And the name of this enzyme is zymase. Zymase imapezeka mu yeast. For the students who bake, I'm sure you are familiar with yeast. Mwiziva yeast. Did you know that yeast is an organism? Yes, it is. In yeast, we're going to find an enzyme known as what? Zymase. Known as what? Zymase. Okay? So this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme called zymase, which is naturally found in yeast. It is not added to yeast, but it is just naturally there. It is naturally found in yeast. The word and chemical equations for alcoholic fermentation are given below. Mwaiona apa ni glucose yeka, kulibe oxygen, because this is happening in the absence. Mwaiona zymase, so this is a catalyzed reaction. It is catalyzed by zymase. Mukamvera word catalyzed, what does that mean? To catalyze simply means to speed up. So zymase is speeding up this process. Okay? Alright, so glucose will be catalyzed, it will be reacted upon, so it's a substrate because this enzyme will act on this glucose to form products. What are the products? Carbon dioxide plus alcohol, which is ethanol, na energy. What is the amount of energy? 210 kilojoules. Naka kaswateni naka chemical reaction kama bwera aka kama bwera kaswateni ku kaswateni kuza nchabeni kaswateni aka reaction kali hapa kaswateni, otherwise tachakamoneke wino, please kaswateni. We're still looking at alcoholic fermentation. We now know that alcoholic fermentation occurs in the absence of oxygen, and the byproducts of alcoholic fermentation are ethanol, which is alcohol, and carbon dioxide. These are the byproducts. So now, what are the uses? Alcoholic fermentation takes place where? Yeast, because ndiwo amene muli enzyme imene takambati zymes. So alcoholic fermentation is important in brewing and baking. Do you bake, my student? Do you bake? If you do, this is the process you use. So alcoholic fermentation is used in brewing, kupanga kamoa, and baking. In both cases, yeast is the organism that is used to carry out the alcoholic fermentation. Now let's look at in brewing. Imasenza bwanje alcoholic fermentation in brewing. Ngatwapanga kamoa patch. How is this method applied? So when brewing, here's how they do it. Germinating seeds are used because they contain the sugar maltose. Let me pause for a minute, my students. Let me pause for a minute. Maltose is a carbohydrate. Mwegwira, maltose, it is made up of glucose. Glucose yabiri, which are simple sugars, they will come together to form maltose. We've done nutrients, so I hope if it's virtually end of income by maltose is made up of glucose. Glucose plus glucose, you're going to form what? Maltose. Alright, cool. So when brewing, germinating seeds are used because they contain the sugar maltose. We already know what makes up maltose. It is glucose, right? The seeds are dried and ground to form a powder. So ayama seeds wazaya yumika. Wakaya yumika wazayatwa. Wakayatwa, they'll form a powder. Alright? This powder is then boiled in water to form a paste. A powder meneza pangika, they are going to boil it with water to form a paste. Asapanga paste. A paste, when it is made, it will be cooled, and once that is done, yeast is added. Yeast is added to that paste. So yeast, it contains an enzyme called zymes, which converts glucose to carbon dioxide and alcohol. You will ask me, nanga glucose ya bwera mobwa? Because glucose niye menepanga maltose. Glucose plus glucose equals maltose. So the enzyme which is in yeast, it will act on the glucose which is forming maltose to form or to produce carbon dioxide and alcohol, releasing energy in the process. Right? What's the amount of energy? 210 itakamba kucha. I'm loving this lesson. The glucose is formed from the action of maltase on maltose. Let's pause there for a minute. Remember, I said maltose is made up of glucose plus glucose. These are the components that make up maltose. So, how is glucose formed? Maltase will act on maltose. Maltase ni enzyme. It will act on maltose. Maltose, when this maltase acts on maltose, glucose and glucose will be formed. The components that are making it, in short, maltase will break down maltose into glucose and glucose. And then the enzyme, which is zymes, will act on glucose to form carbon dioxide and alcohol, releasing energy in the process. Wow, please yemene nachokukamba statement very important, so nifuna muingenese mushe muti igwile. So rewind bwezankonche pang'ono, rewind at least oma seconds before this, rewind at least mumvere na futi vinakamba. Please, the alcohol is removed from the mixture by simple distillation. Simple distillation was our concern was science student, but let me mention something about simple distillation. Mwamene idili simple distillation ka ngati paja mu boiling amanzi and then ngati poto ija ina lidi transparent, mungaone pamene vili mkati mpoto, mumaona ngati mu boiling amanzi kumachoka moisture, ija moisture is hitting ku lid and then yazambonika mungati ni manzi yambodonya futi. Ndi mwamene idili simple distillation. Mwaigwira ka? Yes. So up the alcohol, it is collected by the process of what? Simple distillation. Simple distillation. You learn this in science. Now, what of when baking? Vichavev mashtika. When baking, flour is mixed with water, salt, sugar, and yeast to form a paste called dough or dough. Dough. Alright? When there is insufficient oxygen, meaning that kulibe oxygen, zymes from yeast acts on sugars to form carbon dioxide and alcohol. But if oxygen is sufficient, yeast carries out aerobic respiration, of which we already know. Mwaona ka matius ngati oxygen iliko, yeast it will carry out what? Aerobic respiration. By the way, let me pause. By the way, because mngangale confused. I also alcoholic brewing and baking, they both occur in an organism known as what? Yeast. Let me read. In both cases, yeast is the organism that is used to carry out the alcoholic fermentation. So vetkamba pa vishtikam yeast. So let me continue. So if oxygen is sufficient, meaning if oxygen is present, yeast carries out aerobic respiration. The aerobic respiration, alright, of which we already know what aerobic respiration is. The carbon dioxide begins to form bubbles when aerobic respiration is taking place. The carbon dioxide begins to form what? Bubbles in the dough, causing it to rise. The dough is often placed in a warm place to provide an optimum temperature. Optimum temperature for enzyme activity. We already know what optimum temperature is. This is the temperature at which an enzyme will act its best. So mama ifaka mwa warm to provide that optimum temperature so that the enzyme known as zymes, it will act on the sugars efficiently. Okay? After this, the dough can now be what? After this, the dough can now be baked. Are we following? So these are the processes, and that's how alcoholic fermentation occurs in both cases. Alright, my excellent biology students, let us look at another type of anaerobic respiration, which is lactic fermentation. Lactic fermentation. So what is lactic fermentation? This is the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence of oxygen, producing lactic acid as the only byproduct. In this case, the byproduct is lactic acid only, and it is also taking place in the absence of oxygen. The amount of energy released is very little, about 150 kilojoules from 1 mole of glucose. Very little. Okay, it's actually the least amount of energy released from all the three processes, which is aerobic respiration, alcoholic fermentation, and lactic fermentation. In the chosaingon. So this is the weight equation. Glucose, palbena enzyme, it's just glucose. then lactic acid plus energy. Okay, then chemical equation D ni na kaswateni please, kaswateni. Alright, so lactic fermentation, this process takes place in the muscles of animals during exercise. I lactic fermentation imachitika kuti muma animals paja pamene mchama exercise, mumachita na exercise mumachita chama ngati mumachita. So lactic fermentation imachitika during exercise. This is because the extra energy required by the animal during exercise cannot all be generated by aerobic respiration, since there is a limited supply of oxygen. I will explain, don't worry. Let me just continue reading. This energy is therefore generated by lactic fermentation. However, the lactic acid formed has harmful effects on the body, such as causing fatigue, muscle cramp and fainting. Blood flowing through the muscles carries out lactic fermentation and with it to the brain, and the brain detects its presence. Okay, I will explain, don't worry. It then sends impulses to the rib cage to increase the breathing rate and depth, and to the heart to increase the heart rate. This increases oxygen supply to the muscles. This oxygen is needed to break down lactic acid to water and carbon dioxide. The total amount of oxygen needed to break down the lactic acid produced during exercise is called the oxygen depth. So, Veran, listen. When you start exercising, right? First of all, they are telling us that lactic fermentation occurs where? In the muscles. Why? Because the extra energy required by the animal during exercise cannot all be generated by aerobic respiration, since there is a limited supply of oxygen. This energy is therefore generated by lactic fermentation. Alright? So, when you're exercising, you're using your muscles, you find that your breathing rate will change. Okay, but before it changes, your breathing rate is normal. So when you start exercising, as you continue exercising, in that moment, the oxygen that you're taking in is not enough. Since it is not enough, that is why your breathing rate changes, and then you start breathing in fast to supply your body with more oxygen. Alright, but before that, as you start exercising, your breathing rate is still normal. Therefore, there is limited amount of oxygen. So since there is a limited amount of oxygen, as you begin exercising, lactic fermentation will start taking place. So pamene muliri, if you start running, you find that your breathing rate won't change right there and then. But after some time, the pace a change. So when you start running, your body won't have enough oxygen. So since there is limited supply of oxygen, lactic acid will start taking place to supply your muscles with more energy so that you can continue running. So when that lactic acid is produced, or when lactic fermentation is taking place, lactic acid is produced. So when that lactic acid is now produced, my exercise, what will happen is your blood, it will carry that lactic acid, and then blood imaenda kutupikons, including the brain. So once blood yapita ku brain, once it passes through the brain will detect the presence of lactic acid. Your body understands that lactic acid is harmful for it, because 1, it causes fainting, 2, it causes fatigue, it causes muscle cramp. So to prevent that, it will send an impulse. We're going to learn about neurons very soon, so don't worry about impulses. Impulses to a message, they are electrical message that the brain will send to different parts of our bodies. So your brain will send an impulse Where? To the rib cage, to increase the breathing rate. Okay, it is going to send an impulse to the rib cage so that the rib cage can expand to create more room, because upper manje, your body knows that this person will start taking in a lot of air, so there is need for that space, so that once the lungs are filled with air, they will still find room or space. Okay, so an impulse will be sent to the rib cage to expand, and then another impulse will be sent to the heart to increase the heart rate, mutima mbo bumping a fast match, and then your breathing rate will change. You start taking in more oxygen, so that the oxygen can break down lactic acid to form what? To form carbon dioxide and water. Are you following? That's what happens. So to sum it up, immediately when you start exercising, your breathing rate won't change. Okay, what does that mean? It means there will be limited amount of oxygen, therefore lactic fermentation will start taking place. Once lactic fermentation takes place, lactic acid is going to be produced. This lactic acid will be carried by blood, and once that blood passes through the brain will detect the presence of lactic acid, and then the brain will send an impulse to the rib cage to increase or to expand the rib cage, and then it will send another impulse to the heart to increase the heart rate, and that will cause your breathing rate to change, meaning you start taking in more oxygen. That oxygen will act on the lactic acid, it will break it down, and carbon dioxide and water will be formed. Are you following? That's what happens. So that amount of oxygen that is required immediately when you start exercising, that amount of oxygen that is required is what is referred to as oxygen depth. The total amount of oxygen needed to break down the lactic acid produced during exercise is called the oxygen depth. Alright, my excellent student, let's look at ATP and its significance. So what is ATP? ATP ndiye channel. We'll find out. So energy from respiration is not used directly by organisms, but is used to produce ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So it's an energy produced after respiration. It is not used directly by an organism. Instead, it is used to form or to produce ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. How is ATP formed? By combining adenosine diphosphate, which is ADP, and inorganic phosphate, which is PI. So the energy that is produced from respiration, it is not directly used. Instead, it is used to form ATP by combining ADP and PI, which is inorganic phosphate. So energy from ATP is then used by living organisms. When the energy is needed, ATP breaks down to ADP and inorganic phosphate, releasing energy in the process. The formation and breakdown of ATP can be illustrated as follows. So I think I'll explain better with this diagram. So we're saying that the energy from respiration, it is used to form ATP. As you can see, energy from respiration used it to form what? ATP, by combining ADP and inorganic phosphate. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate, okay? PI inorganic phosphate. So they will combine to form ATP. Energy from respiration will be used to combine these two to form ATP. So when your body now needs the energy, this will break down. When it breaks down, energy will be released. So it will break down into what? It will break down into ADP and PI. And in the process of it breaking down, energy is released. So that's the moment must keep up. Importance of ATP. So ATP is important because it makes it possible for energy to be stored and transported. Remember what I said here. I said when energy is now needed, so meaning it was stored. So now that it is needed, this will break down, and in the process of it breaking down into ADP and PI, energy is released. Okay, so meaning ATP makes it possible for energy to be what? To be stored and transported. Then when it is needed, when energy is now needed, ATP will break down. Yeah. And then it makes energy available when and where it is needed. Alright, now let's look at the importance of respiration, which is the final part of this tutorial video. The energy released during respiration is used in the following processes. Number one, maintenance of constant body temperature, reproduction, cell division, active transport, and growth or synthesis of macromolecules. There are a lot of activities. Walking, there are a lot of activities, because the energy from respiration enables us to carry out different activities a lot. So there are a lot of reasons why respiration is important. Alright, my excellent biology students, this is the end of this tutorial video. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you've learned something from this video. Please watch it again, study the notes, and do the assignments. This has been Mr. Philip Kauma, the excellent biology tutor. Stay blessed.